these are the IBUS 1 laws, and they are ranked in order from number 1 to like the most important to least important, from top to bottom. And then Jim, can you tell me what is Patrick's Law?
I will tell you what Patrick's Law is. So back years ago, I was teaching a introduction to business class at Golden West. And we got a discussion about my experience in dealing with companies that were acquired. My job at the time was that the company I worked for, they would acquire businesses, they would buy them, and then I would be assigned the responsibility of getting them to work, making them profitable. So one of the things that we learned pretty quickly was that the hardest thing to do was to maintain the revenue stream, that we'd buy a company and then the revenue would go away. So the lesson that I learned was the single most complicated thing to create and sustain is revenue certainty. And so I told this story in class one day, and this was like a Tuesday, Thursday class, right? Twice a week. I come back the next day on Thursday and somebody said, "Hey, what did you say, about that thing?" And I goes, "I don't remember what I said." And out of the back, a young girl basically said, "Hey, you said revenue certainty." I goes, "That's it. You get 50 points. And she goes, "Actually, I didn't remember that. Patrick did." And it was a full classroom, so it was hard to see everybody. And I said, "Who's Patrick?" And Patrick was the guy who sat next to her that I noticed he carried her books everywhere she went on campus, right? So it was named Patrick's Law. That's why we call it Patrick's Law. Revenue certainty. The single most important thing in business is revenue certainty.
All right, thank you. And then what about Mucci's Law?
Well, that should give you some idea how important law number 1 is. If I name the law named after me is 2. And that is, you need to have an intimate knowledge of the basic transaction of whatever business you're in. So somebody comes along to me and says, "Hey, how would you like to get into the hairdressing business?" And I would say, "No, thank you, because I don't know anything about it." Right? If they came along and said, "Hey, how would you like to get in the trucking business?" Okay, I'm more interested because I have experience in it. I know how the basic transaction works. The quickest way to lose money is to invest in something you don't understand. And intimate knowledge of the basic transaction, not the financial statements, not the marketing brochure, but the single transaction. You look at every single transaction. Is that profitable? And then how many of those transactions can we do?
All right, and then what about John's Law?
What about it?
What does it mean by like don't mistake understanding and compassion for weakness in business? How does
Well,
that?
I'm going to tell you. I was working on a project for a client, and we were working through my client's vendor. And the manager of the location of my client's vendor wasn't probably up to the task of his job, right? So I used to take him to lunch all the time when I was in Salt Lake City. I'd take him to lunch, got to know him personally, went and watched ball games with him, right? And he kept getting in the way of us getting done what we needed to get done. And I kept pointing out to him at lunch. I goes, "Hey, we need to be able to do this, right? Or it's going to be a problem." And he just kept becoming an obstacle. So I went to my client and said, "I think we got a problem in Salt Lake City. We all muster up in San Francisco in a conference room. My client and this guy's boss is in the room, and who I knew. And I got asked, what's the issue?" I laid it out very unemotionally. He got fired on the spot, right? And John, he was one of the representatives, his description of what happened was this particular person mistook my understanding and compassion for weakness. And it ended up costing him his job. That's because I was nice about it. Didn't mean that he wasn't getting in the way. He thought because I wasn't yelling and screaming that he could keep doing it. Well, he was wrong.
And then what about McCullen's law? Having an exit strategy.
Okay. McMillan's Law is named after my boss at Long Beach City College. Great boss, by the way. He and I chat about entrepreneurship all the time. And one of his point was, you really shouldn't start a business unless you have an exit strategy. And I have to agree with him. So if I start a business, I got to say, okay, do I want to do this for 3 years and sell it? Do I want to do it for 5 years and turn it over to my kids? Do I want to do it for 10 years? Do I want to do it forever? Do I want to do it till I run out of money? You really should think about that before you start where you want to end up at. And that's a great piece of advice, because it forces you to make some decisions before you invest your time and money in the business.
And then what about Micah's law?
Micah's law. So one of the questions on one of my tests is, will women pay more for Italian shoes than Chinese shoes? Right? So if the woman is simply looking for, or man or woman, it doesn't matter, is simply looking for the functionality of a shoe, they're liable to buy a Chinese shoe. If they're looking for a fashion statement, they're most likely going to buy an Italian shoe. But fashion isn't necessarily the basic need. So people will pay the minimum amount to get their basic set of needs met. Now, if my basic set of needs are that I want to impress my neighbors, I'm going to pay a little higher price than somebody says, look, I just need something to cover my feet.
And then what about Bruce's law?
If I remember who Bruce was. He's one of my students. So in the old days, when I started out, in the Japanese companies, as an example, they would lay out their strategic plan 20 years out, right? We're going to do this in 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20. Well, today, particularly now with COVID, we have no earthly idea where the economy is going to be, where business is going to be, where the environment's going to be. And so if you stick with the plan you wrote 5 years ago and the environment you're in keeps changing, you're going to be at a disadvantage. And so what you really want now are adaptable organizations. We call it driving with the windows down. Okay, we got a plan, we're operating, we're moving along, and all of a sudden something changed, we adapt to those changes. And organizations that can adapt, and not many can, have a competitive advantage.
And then what is Sean's law?
Actually, I remember who Sean is. Yeah, he's the chief supply chain officer of a big organization, right? And he and I have worked on supply chain and logistics issues, right? And the key every time was, how do we develop a highly reliable first, then cost effective. It doesn't say lowest cost. It turns out that if you're highly reliable and cost effective, you generally speaking can do things faster and less expensive than your competitors, but you have to start with highly reliable.
And then what about Bloch's law?
Peter Bloch, famous guy. His whole issue was, if you focus on service over your self-interest, you can build a sustainable business and sustainable relationships. His primary point was, if, like with the interns that we have, my role is to help them. If I help them, they will take care of the things that I need, but I need to focus on what their needs are versus me just giving orders every day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you apply that to a business, you develop longer term customers and you can sustain the growth, aka your revenue stream.
And then what about the last law, Eddie's law?
Eddie's law is one of my students. Basically, when he wrote up at the end, it was, the school reviews you, and so he gets a survey and he comes to this was when we had face-to-face classes, went through the entrepreneur class. And as he's walking out the door, he goes, hey, this is not all that complicated. Excuse me. This is not all that complicated. And I goes, Eddie, no, it's not. Right. And so that's where we get it from. In the entrepreneurial business, it's not complicated. You develop a better mousetrap, develop something a lot of people want that they can't get, sell it at a price they can afford, and you're in business. Not that complicated.
Mhm. And those are all the IBUS 1 laws.